Don, I have been long immersed in the science versus religion wars, and I'm always intrigued
Mhm.
how the same piece of data can be taken by theists and atheists, the same piece of data, to argue their own positions.
Yes.
How have you found that to be the case or not the case?
Well, there's one very interesting piece of data that's come up recently, and that is the so-called God spot in the brain, right?
Temporal lobe.
In
Yeah.
the temporal lobe. So you can take something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, a very powerful magnet, and touch it to just the skull at a certain part of the temporal lobe. And atheists and theists alike find themselves ushered into the presence of some supernatural being, into the presence of God. And so you can take that, that's an empirical fact. And so you can now take it to support theism or atheism. So if you're a theist, you can say, well, look, God is there, and he put a receptor in the brain so that we could understand him. So that's why the receptor is there. If you're an atheist, you can say, well, this just shows that God is just a product of brain activity. It's just a figment of our brain. It's a figment of our imagination. So the data itself is inconclusive about whether you want to believe in God or not. If you're going to believe either way, you have to do it on grounds other than the neurophysiological data.
But what's interesting there is that both sides will use that as proof of their position. They won't say what you're saying. Many people will say that that is proof or part of the proof of the veracity of their position.
So both sides can use it to justify their position, but from the scientific point of view, you don't want to overextend your reach. You want to take your data and make sober conclusions from your data and not, I mean, the whole point of science is to get a deep understanding, not to try to defend a position. So we need to take this data and ask, what are the reasonable conclusions we can make from the fact that this part of the brain, when it's stimulated, leads you into the presence of God? What are the sober conclusions we can make from that, and not try to support a doctrinaire point of view.
What in consciousness studies, which is your area, could impinge on this science and religion debate? Are there areas in consciousness studies that are similar to the so-called God spot in the brain that can be interpreted one or two different ways?
Well, the science and religion debate has turned on a couple things. One is on evolution. And the religious people often don't like something about evolution. They're not really often sure what it is, but they don't like
The
it.
total randomness, I would say, that is what they don't like. As long as God has a hand in there and moving things or setting an initial condition, that some people can be sad. Not everyone.
That's
Some
right.
of them want God making miracles every little moment. But many
right.
are now quite satisfied if God set the initial condition or God created the structure of the laws so that they naturally follow towards this teleological an end that God intended. So they're happy with that.
That's right. So it's the physicalism of standard evolutionary theory that they're unhappy with.
Yes.
What's the naturalistic assumption, namely that there is no God, there is no designer behind the scenes making this thing all work out. It's literally just the laws of physics and nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the consciousness work that I'm doing has used evolution to conclude that our perceptions of space and time are just a species-specific interface. They're not the truth. So
Now that's a remarkable result that you've come up with.
it's non-standard.
And that's the calmest way I think anybody could put it. It's a fantastic, and I use that not necessarily in a nice way, a result that evolution has produced a perceptive awareness that's good for survival fitness, but is poor for assessing ultimate reality. Now, if I allow you to say that that's true, what are the implications for God and a science interface?
Well, I'm not sure what the implications are for God, but for the debate between the religious and the scientists on this point, it does have big implications.
Well, tell me.
So the big implications there are, I embrace evolution, but reject the physicalism. So that's an unusual position. I don't know too many people who take that position that say we have to take evolution seriously. There's clear evidence for it,
Yes.
but we have to walk away from the physicalist assumptions of it. And that's not the same thing as saying now let's embrace an intelligent designer behind the whole thing. So so I'm taking a position that no one else on the playing field is taking here. I'm saying that I agree with the religious that physicalism seems to be false. I disagree with them that in saying that you need to have an all-wise God to make the whole thing work out. I agree with the scientists in saying we have to take evolution quite seriously. I disagree with them in saying that evolution can explain how consciousness arises, and it can explain everything that we need to do about the mind-body problem. I disagree with them completely, and there I think the evidence is in my favor. There are no theories of consciousness from a physicalist point of view. So there's something to make both sides unhappy with what I have to say here.
Yeah, and that makes you happy.
But it's an interesting position to be in, because I'm using evolution to conclude that physicalism is false, which is which makes both sides unhappy. The physicalism is false makes the religious happy, but maybe not that evolution is there. And I still don't need to have an intelligent designer running the whole thing. And yet, giving up the physicalism is going to make certainly most evolutionary biologists unhappy.
Right. You don't need a designer, but you do need a primordial consciousness.
So I don't need a primordial big consciousness. The mathematical models that I'm developing right now are models of specific finite consciousnesses and their interactions. Now, I could imagine these consciousnesses having larger and larger so-called channel capacities to the point where they have an infinite channel capacity, and then you could say...
Yeah, I mean, your kind of consciousness doesn't require a God, right, but it is consistent with a God.
Well, I guess if you just take God to be consciousness, then...
Well, consistent says that God has to be conscious. God can be a lot of other things. It can be Eastern
right,
gods, Western gods. I mean, a lot of things you can go from there. But for you to conclude that consciousness is not a standard physicalist product of evolution,
right,
is a significant statement.
It certainly is significant, and I would say, part of the problem with the word God is it means so many different things in different religions. So it's a difficult one to deal with. Certainly, I say consciousness is fundamental, and if some religious group says, well, that's what we mean by God, God is consciousness, then I'm giving them something that could be useful to them. If they want to say something else, that God is something other than consciousness, then maybe my views won't be of much help to them. But I
think it'll be help, but it won't be dispositive. It won't confirm what they're saying.
That's right.
But it could be a start to put them on the road, at least against the physicalist view.
Yeah, I think that to the extent that many religious groups really want to take on physicalism, I am giving them quite a few tools for that. That's for sure.